Hi, folks. We're just going to give people a few minutes to join in. We did open it up a little bit early, so thank you for bearing with us.
Hello. Nice to see you all and meet you.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello, Carolina. How are you?
Hi, Velma or Vilma. Nice to meet you. Nice to see your face.
Yeah, good to meet you. Thank you for
How do I pronounce your name?
participating. Velma with a
Velma.
V. Uh-huh.
Velma. Okay. Thank you.
Shani, thank you for being there.
Thank
It's
you. And it's pronounced Shanae.
Shanae. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Shanae. You know, we have about over 100 people signed up for this Lunch and Learn. I'm looking for third. Is third there?
Third is on the call. Yes, we're waiting for Brandon.
I'm right here.
Oh, okay. Thank you, third.
Thank you.
And where's Mr. Hershey? Brandon. No. We'll just wait a few more minutes for Brandon Hershey to sign in. Thank you all for being here today. Appreciate your attendance and your participation. We have a few questions to start out with for the panelists, but if you have any questions, please put it on the chat and we'll ask it.
Also, just a couple announcements before we get started, or really just one. The EEC has our annual Decolonizing Education Conference coming up November 3rd through the 5th, 2021. It will be hosted at the Greater Tacoma Convention Center. It will be hosted, sorry about that, at the Greater Tacoma Convention Center down in Tacoma, Washington. I will drop the link to our conference website as well as the link to our event page on Facebook. If you want to get on there and take a look, we have 4 keynote speakers to look forward to. This coming conference, we have Tiffany Jewell, Jeff Duncan and Dorada, Cindy Domingo, as well as Justice Raquel Montoya Lewis. And I will go ahead and drop that Facebook event in the chat. Registration is currently open with our early bird special. And by the end of this week, we'll be announcing all of our workshops that will be presented, as well as our workshop presenters and our agenda. So a lot of things to look forward to coming up that conference. So go ahead and check it out. Get registered while we still have tickets, and we hope to see you all there in the fall.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here today. This is our Decolonizing Education. What does that mean? Lunch and Learn, which is the first of many in our Decolonizing Education series before we get to our Decolonizing Education Conference come November. Again, like Velma had said, if you are an audience participant and you have any questions throughout this Lunch and Learn, please drop them in the chat and we will be sure to get to all or as many of them as we possibly can. And with that, I am going to go ahead and allow our panelists to introduce themselves. Let's start with Shanae.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. First, I want to just say how honored I am to be part of the panel today. My name is Dr. Shanae Washington, and I bring you greetings from Seattle, Washington, the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish peoples. the traditional lands and waters of the tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. I am originally from Rockaway, Queens, New York. I am the proud mother of two beautiful and brilliant daughters who are high schoolers in Seattle Public Schools. I am also a long-term educator who began my career as an elementary school teacher and later middle school teacher in Prince George's County, Maryland. Currently, I am an assistant professor of justice and equity in education in the College of Education at UW Seattle. My teaching and research center the scholarships, the histories, the educational experiences, and the justice agendas of Black and Indigenous communities. I teach courses on decolonizing teacher education, as well as a history of Black and Indigenous self-determination in education, and also a teaching social studies for social justice course at the UW. And as a community-based researcher, I use Indigenous and decolonizing methodology, community engagement, advocacy in the lives and education of their children.
Thank you, Dr. Shanae. And Carolina?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Hi, my name is Carolina Forero, or Caro. I am in Seattle as well, in the land of the Duwamish people. And I am an instructor at Seattle Central College. I teach English to immigrant refugee language learners, adults. And it doesn't, I guess I could say my work has been on how our field in itself is colonizing and how to decolonize that field of ESL or English language teaching. So that's been sort of the focus of my work. I am the mother of a 7-year-old vivacious child, and I was born and raised in Colombia. I was there until I was 17, and then I moved here 20 something years ago. So in that process, I've also been working on what it means to be Colombian in Colombia and in their own colonization history, and how to be an immigrant in this country. And I think the other thing I can share is just the way that my teaching has been guided by decolonization practices and learning and unlearning what that means and what it doesn't mean, and how that can be done in the classroom. I'm very, very honored and happy to be here with you all today.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Third?
Peace and greetings, everyone. Dr. Third Andreessen. Since we're talking about decolonization, third generation Filipino American from the territory of occupied Duwamish, and my grandparents moved to the United States or to the mainland when the Philippines was still a US colony, a US territory in the 1930s. I earned my PhD in the College of Ed, multicultural education under James Banks and Geneva Gay. I'm a principal investigator of the 206 Hip Hop Archive at Suzzallo Library. The first time they reached out to me, they had about 48 songs on Seattle hip hop, and 90% of that was Macklemore. So that's already been problematic. And I ended up collecting about 2,000 songs after that. It was predominantly Black artists, Indigenous artists, and that's how it's gonna stay, and that's gonna be. And if UW's playing a little funny games, I'm pulling all those out. Also, director of the Hawaii program at the Comparative History of Ideas. And I'm teaching Filipino American history at the American Ethnic Studies Department. And yeah, I'm still decolonizing myself, learn a lot of anti-Blackness along the way. For a person or part of the group that's been colonized and ended up being settler colonial as well. And I'm still trying to, get rid of that, whether I know it or not, whether I'm participating or not. I have that settler colonial anti-Blackness thing that I'm really trying to, get rid of. And, it's been 41 years. I have 3 daughters who constantly checks me on my patriarchy and my homophobia and the misogyny and so on and so forth. And I'm also learning how to get rid of all of that.
Thank you so much. So for panelists, I'm just gonna ask y'all some questions and feel free to just hop on into it. You don't have to ask me to speak, nothing like that. So our first question is, what does decolonizing education mean and look like to you? And I'll start off with Carolina.
Thank you. This is something of course, we've been thinking a lot about. And before we do that, I want to say, I don't know all. Dr. Third, I'm with you. I'm still in the process of decolonizing and unlearning anti-Blackness and Latinx, and in our community that is rampant. So this is something that I am unlearning myself. So when I think of decolonization, the first thing I think of is the giving back of land, repatriation of land that was stolen. And this I learned from an article titled "Decolonization is Not a Metaphor." And then when I think about that in education, I was having this conversation with a group of colleagues yesterday. What does that mean in our class? Right. So what I'm thinking about is when we think of colonization, is the taking of land, the taking of knowledge, the taking of practices, forcibly, the taking of religion. And so when we are in our classroom, right, what voice are we centering? What curriculum are we centering? And what stories are we telling our students? And how are we centering our students? So when I think of, hold on, let me just share. I have a quote by Bell Hooks here. This is from Teaching Critical Thinking by Bell Hooks. So education was structured to reinforce white supremacy, teaching white children ideologies of dominance and Black children ideologies of subordination, right? So when we are decolonizing education, we're dismantling that, right? And that shows up in the way that we assess, in the way that we design curriculum, in the way that we practice and build relationships with students and other colleagues. And so I'm going to leave it at that because I actually really want to hear from the other 2 panelists. But what I'm thinking is dismantling white supremacy in our own practices and checking our own ways in which we uphold white supremacy and dismantle it at the same time, because they both can happen at the same time, right? So I'm going to leave it at that, and then we'll continue more. I want to make sure we have space for everybody.
And Dr. Third?
I second Carolina's statement. For me, decolonizing is really not about, have your, chair at the table. It's more of like decolonizing. Colonizing to me is really about stealing and enslavement and exploitation. So for me, decolonizing is reversing all of that. When when a white person uses the word decolonize, I'm not really sure how much they know what decolonization is. A lot of them probably thinks about, oh yeah, we're just gonna have like equal share. To me, now you guys gotta go. That's just me. You gotta go. If you're talking about decolonizing, then sometimes you gotta wish, be careful what you wish for, because decolonizing to me is you gotta step down and you gotta provide not really provide, but yeah, that in a nutshell, you gotta go.
And Dr. Shanae?
Okay, so sorry, my internet is a bit unstable. So I moved right next to the router. Hopefully it won't freeze and push me out of their meeting. But for me, I think it's starting with the knowledge that Indigenous and Black communities and other communities of color were educating their children in their homes and communities long before the permanent settlement of European colonizers and long before the imposition of colonial schools. And also the knowledge that they continue to exercise self-determination in the education of their children through present day. So I think starting there is important. I also think, as the other two panelists have mentioned, is recognizing like the history and the ongoing mission of colonial schools. So like roughly 2 months ago, more people around the world, including the United States, became aware of the cultural and physical genocide that took place in colonial schools in Canada when the remains of 215 Indigenous children were found in mass graves on the site of a former residential school there. And we know that since that time, over 1,000 bodies of missing Indigenous children have been found on the grounds of other residential schools throughout Canada. And what we should also know is that the US has their own dark history of cultural and physical genocide of Indigenous and other children of color. They had their own boarding schools and mission schools, which were sites of colonization, right? These were places where they were massive instruments of colonization, and the goal was to erase the Indigenous identity and to replace it through assimilation, through practices of subordination and control tactics, right? These were places where Indigenous youth experienced physical, sexual, and emotional harm, and where many of them figuratively and literally did not make it out of these institutions alive, right? We also know that there's a history of cultural genocide within Black communities, and scholars such as Bell Hooks talk about what happened after the Brown versus Board of Education and school integration, and the removal, or to better state it, the mass firing of Black teachers and administration, and how this really contributed and transformed schools, places of submission and assimilation and microaggressions and spirit murdering, which Bettina Love describes as being situated in anti-darkness and systemic oppression, right? So knowing that history is important, and to also be aware of that colonial education persists in contemporary schools, right? Our students of color and with all their intersectional identities continue to experience racism and microaggressions and criminalization and spirit murdering and cultural erasure in contemporary schools. And so for me, decolonizing education is about cultural revitalization, where we are centering the histories, the heritages, the values of Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other students who have been historically and contemporarily marginalized in schools. It is about returning families and communities of color to their rightful place as educators, leaders, consultants, advisors in schools that serve their children. It's about dismantling these policies and practices, right, that punish and that harm our students of color. It is about thinking about how we educate our teachers and leaders, right? And helping them to engage in ongoing, like reflexive practice about their own biases and ways that they are complicit in and perpetuators of white supremacy in the colonized school system. It is, again, right, honoring and learning from that long history of Black and Indigenous self-determination in the education of their children. And it's listening to Black, Brown, Indigenous, bi-multilingual, disabled, queer, and and other communities of color, and especially our youth in schools, right, who have experienced the most oppression in schools and who are best able to tell us what we need to do to decolonize the school system.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shanae. So my next question is, is kind of diving into like our schools in the classroom is how can teachers be included in the decolonizing education conversation in ways that hold their actions accountable? And any of the panelists, feel free to just hop on that.
I can jump in because when I think of holding teachers accountable, right? And it's, oh God, it's so difficult because you see the white supremacy showing up, right? The fragility, the defensiveness, the either or thinking. And when you try to bring accountability, it becomes so personal that teachers sometimes can't see, right, what's in front of them. And so I always think of constant, like Dr. Shanae, when you were saying, how do we educate our teachers, right? And emphasizing reflection and ongoing reflection about what our practices are and what values and beliefs do we bring into the classrooms and how they impact our students negatively or positively, and having those conversations and staying away from the personal, right? Because and also again, what Dr. Shanae said, the knowledge and understanding of what is white supremacy, because sometimes people hear white supremacy and they're like, I'm not a racist, I'm a nice person. And I'm like, yes, you can be a nice person. Sure, you can have coffee with a person of color and you can call yourself not a racist, but you can still uphold white supremacy. It can be both. So providing spaces for people to truly understand white supremacy, what it is, systemic white supremacy, and inviting reflection about how is it that I'm doing it, and then what can I do to change it. And it's a community accountability. And some people will be racist and they're racist and that's what it is. But the people that that the nice people who don't want to do harm, is how do you invite those conversations for reflection? But how am I why am I assessing the way that I assess? Why do I only give papers, right? Instead of an oral presentation that a student can record? Why can't that also count as knowledge, right? What, deadlines, what is it about a deadline that's gonna make it or break it for you, right? And, I always say, well, they need to be prepared for the world. I'm like, okay, the world can also be flexible with deadlines. So there are all these little pieces, right? But I think it comes down to reflection and ongoing, and teaching teachers how to be reflective in a way that is not personal, but is seeing themselves in a system that has created a place where students are being harmed, and also moving away from the person to the system, moving away from I'm a nice teacher, right, to let's look at how you're showing up to the classroom. Let's look at what materials are you bringing to the classroom and why. Why is it important for you to teach that book? Why is it important for you to show that video? Why is it important for you to tell that story in a certain way, or to create a story a certain way? What relationships are you building with your students? And I think when they have that conversation, and deep conversation, which is uncomfortable, and it should be uncomfortable, I think we can get somewhere to accountability and trust and respect for each other and for our students.
I echo everything that Carolina, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, has shared. That critical, thank you. Critical self-reflection is so important. Understanding these like white supremacy and its prevalence and continued existence in schools is essential. But I would also add the importance of knowing the history of settler colonialism and colonial education. A scholar called Megan Bang has theorized and written with others, and found that many non-Indigenous and mostly white educators and administrators are often unaware of and unfamiliar with the history of colonial education as it concerns Indigenous children, and I would add other children of color as well. and that they're often unfamiliar with the fact that schools continue to be shaped by and reflect settler colonial agendas, right? And so then they go on to argue of the need for critical historicity, that it's a necessary foundation. And I would also add that they must, also be aware of that this is not something that happened in the past, it's there in the past, right? But that these white supremacist, assimilationist aims of colonial education persist in our contemporary schools, right? And so I think that having that knowledge of history is also essential in being able to engage them in these conversations, and also in being able to hold them accountable, and hopefully with this knowledge and with, that ongoing critical reflection, they'll be able to hold themselves, right, and each other accountable.
I second everyone's assertion. To me, I don't even call it racism. I call it is what it is, white supremacy, because the system of white supremacy, it's a system that privileges and where white folks participate and benefit from at the expense of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And for me to talk to a white faculty or a white teacher, I really have to have, I sit down with them. I mean, even to my students, my white students, and understand when folks would say only white people can be racist, that means something. It's not trash talking. That means something that has something to do with power. That if you participate in it and if you benefit from it, you're a white supremacist and you don't even know. Because most of the time, if not all the time, we've been taught to equivocate white supremacy with the KKK or the neo-Nazi or the Proud Boys, so on and so forth. But we're not taught that this is a system. That's how white supremacy works. I mean, has anybody seen Fight Club? What's the first rule of Fight Club? Don't talk about Fight Club. So that's how the system of white supremacy manifests in all aspects of our lives. And I can't really have an authentic conversation with white folks if they don't really acknowledge that they're white supremacists. Because if, let's say, a person in the field of biology, right, participate and benefit from the field of biology, what does that make you? A biologist, okay? If you benefit from the field of physics and participate in it, that makes you a physicist. If you benefit from the system or the field of white supremacy, what does that make you? A white supremacist. I mean, so on and so forth. This also has to do with men. If you're a guy and you participate and benefit from this system of patriarchy, whether you like it or not, I'm going to let you know that you're sexist, you're a misogynist, so on and so forth, with homophobia, classist, ableist. And if we can't have that understanding that, we participate in everybody else's oppression and marginalization, to me, I can't even talk to you. And if the student's not going to understand what's a lot of them are on social media talking about, how come there's a lot of folks, especially Black folks, like, oh, Black folks can't be racist. But there's a reason why that is, because when we define racist, we always use a white supremacist Noah Webster dictionary to define what racism is with no type of critical analysis. But if we start to define white supremacy or racism as a system where white folks benefit from it, then perhaps we can have some type of understanding. Yeah, I mean, this is like a frustrating, all the questions has been pretty much frustrating because, we go through this every day. I see this in faculty meetings. I see this in the classroom. I see this everywhere. And, to me, it's a trigger.
Thank you, Dr. Third. So I wanted a couple questions from the chat. First one is from Tabitha. I'm a secondary educator and my building is stagnating in these conversations right now. Lots of defensiveness, lots of I'm the nice person that Dr. Carolina is talking about. One thing I think that could be helpful for my building is to see a breakdown of the policies, like the late work policy, the way they impact our students differently, and how they perpetrate white supremacy. Do any of you have specific resources or suggestions in how Tabitha might access these types of conversations to share with colleagues?
Okay, I feel like I always jump in first, and I am okay with silence too. So, one thing that I always think about and that has been helpful is not so much on the late the deadlines and stuff like that, but there is this book called Culturally Responsive Teaching on the Brain by Dr. Zarita Hammond, and she talks a lot about what happens physiologically in our brains. Oh, there it is. When we have certain practices in the classroom, right? So one example, sorry, my Spanish just came out. One example that she gives is, when we build trust in the classroom, we are wired to be in community. We are wired to form connections. And when you build those trust, students develop, their cortisol levels go down, right? So it increases higher order thinking. But when you don't have that and you have the stress of deadlines or multiple choice quizzes or time quizzes or whatever it is that people are doing, those levels of cortisol increase. They start in the body 20 minutes and they stay in the body for 3 hours, right? And so what does that do to learning? And sometimes having this kind of understanding, it takes away, that people like to intellectualize things, which, I don't know if I want to give people all that all the time, but sometimes this helps because they give very clear examples of what happens physically to students, especially younger students, when some of these practices are enacted in the classroom. And you can't argue with that. Well, some people might argue with science. We're seeing that nowadays, but for the most part, you can't argue with that, right? And giving people the thing to hold on to. And she's awesome too. She has a really cool Facebook page and they have all kinds of forums. If you haven't followed her, I highly recommend her. So that will be one resource that I think people will be able to grasp on and hopefully deal with the defensiveness, but I don't know.
I think,
sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay. I apologize if I cut you off. I mean, when I'm in the classroom, I'm just going to provide like an example. Teaching this class at Comparative History of Ideas called Critical Community Organizing. And just about any class that I teach, I'm to a point where I don't even assign white authors anymore. I mean, if there's any, it's probably McIntosh, Peggy McIntosh, and that's probably as white as you can get. And most of the literature, the articles that I assign to students are mostly Black scholars, Indigenous scholars, definitely Indigenous scholars, and other scholars of color. I mean, I don't even wear white socks. I wear black socks. I wear brown socks. I wear multicolored socks. And anything that has to do with white or associated with whiteness, it reflects in the classroom. One time, because I also teach with Representative Deloria in Critical Community Organizing, and when we would have guest speakers, And this is what I said to the students, because I think Representative Rick Larson came and, right in front of Rick Larson said, like, this is probably the only white male that you guys are going to end up seeing in this classroom, because the rest is going to be Black, Indigenous, and guests of color. As far as resources, there's a lot of resources that that perhaps folks can reach out to. I mean, this whole thing is a resource. As far as books, yeah, for me, it's mostly BIPOC authored books. And as far as things in the classroom, I don't do tests. I don't do these traditional tests. This, you got to fill in this bubble. You got to multiple choice it. You got to true or false it. And a lot of the stuff that I do is pretty hands-on, experiential based learning. I would have folks organize a show, to show that in community organizing, these are the things that you need to do. And again, as far as resources, reach out to the folks in your network. If, as much as you can, use BIPOC authors. That's why they're authors. That's why they're scholars. Yeah.
Yes, I want to echo Dr. Third, like in my own teaching, like the scholars that students are reading about are mainly BIPOC folks. So I think about the teacher education programs that I teach in at UW, and I know one author that they and myself are really excited about is Bettina Love. So anything by her book, We Want to Do More Than Survive. Also, she's done a ton of webinars and podcasts that are great. Like she's done them with other scholars like Godi Muhammad and Yolanda Sealy Ruiz. I think I'm saying that last name correctly. I think about this, like this here is a resource, right? This Lunch and Learn today, sharing that link. Last week, I attended this great webinar on the backlash against critical race theory and what this means for our children and what we can do about it, right? So things like that, as we see this, these advertisements for webinars come up in our inboxes through email to share that. I think about last year after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and how many resources came out and how there just seemed to be an awakening of folks who didn't notice or see it before, right? And so think about all of the great resources and podcasts that came out of that time and that season. Because I also think about teachers, time is precious and important, and they may not have time to read books, but they may be able to listen to a podcast, right? Or listen to the recording of a webinar like we have here today. So that's what I would suggest.
Can I add one more thing? I'm sorry.
Yes, please.
All right, Dr.
Yeah.
Ferrer.
I so appreciate you guys calling me doctor. Not yet, hopefully in 3 years. I'm a doctor in the making. So another thing in terms of facilitating these conversations in our programs or in our divisions, or, it's finding someone in leadership, right, that is going to provide space and compensation for doing this work, right? This work should not be done for free. And also it is much more richer to have a team of people from the same program attend a webinar or a conference or listen to a podcast together and then come back together and say, okay, how does this apply to what we are doing? How does this apply to our classroom? And so I would say and I think this might relate a little bit to a later question about, how do you work in conservative areas, but find people that also want to do this work and advocate for funding and time so that you can start building together. It might not be everybody, and for a long time now, I have abandoned the notion of trying to convince people to not be anti-racist. And I'm like, I'm just gonna hang with my anti-racist peeps and do the work with them, just for my own mental and emotional health. So find those people and push for time and compensation to do this work and start building.
I mean, for the folks that are, critiquing CRT, a lot of those folks, they really never taken CRT classes before. They've never really taken AES before. I mean, maybe they took 2 and, just got, dissuaded by it and whatever. I mean, nowadays, I just call them clansplaining. I mean, if you're going to be, again, critiquing against CRT, you're clansplaining to me. Usually they, again, white folks get scared of those words, white supremacists and Klan. And I'm just letting them know that, whenever you do that critique, it's part of this trauma. It's part of this microaggression. It's part of this exploitation and colonization. I mean, folks are talking about, let's preserve the Confederate statue. And then when you got the CRT, let's destroy CRT. I mean, it's, white supremacy ain't really got no rationality, I don't know where they're getting it from, but if somebody could help me with that, at the end of the day, it is what it is. They're clansplaining.
Thank you. So another question from the chat from Amber is, what have you noticed about the role part white multiracial folks play or could play in decolonizing education?
Could you repeat the question?
Yes. What have you noticed about the role part white multiracial folks play or could play in the process of decolonizing education?
It's always a suspect to me. I really have to sit down and check their temperature to see where they're at. Usually, biracial, part white, sometimes, tends to, go the other way. And that's when, people get checked. The idea that, oh, if we could just have a biracial world, this whole thing would disappear. Be like, no, it won't, because we've all had a biracial world and we're still in the same situation. And one of the only ways that this will all disappear is to dismantle the system of white supremacy, patriarchy, heterosis normative, ableism, capitalism, so on and so forth. I'm always on guard, because every time you become comfortable, and that's when they're like, give you the 1-2, and you're just like, what just happened? And I'm to a point where I just want to make sure that, whatever folks coming out of their mouth is not going to further marginalize, folks. And oftentimes when a part white, multiracial folk would, use the non-white part of their identity, for convenience. And, we've seen that happen. There's a lot of half white, half native, white passing would who had never been really been affiliated with a particular nation or particular tribe would use, their Native Americanness to get scholarships. These things happen. And, but at the end of the day, for me, I can work with, half white, half non-white folks, perhaps better than I could work with white folks. Because, you know, and again, if I'm talking about within the Filipino American community, the Filipino and white, in that context, that, you know, I'll be able to sit down with them more, you know, with, you know, less trigger, with less microaggression than somebody that, you know, that's full, you know, full white.
I'll add that I don't believe it's like any one person or one group's responsibility. I think there's a lot to be said about coalition building, right? And working in coalition and in collaboration with communities of color, right? Breaking out beyond our own racial intersectional groups, right? And coming together as a collective. A lot of this work needs to be taken up by white folks, where they are learning, doing a lot of learning and unlearning, and also learning how to not just be allies, but be accomplices with communities of color, and being able to engage in this work. So, like, to that question of if I'm part white, right? We've heard a lot of not overburdening or putting all of the labor on folks of color, whether you know, are part white or fully, you know, one particular ethnic group. That we can't look at it in that way, right? We have to think about coalition building. We have to see this as collective work and not work done by individuals or one particular group.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would add also, just to, you know, to like, what's the role, right? It's just the role, I think, is understanding the positionality, right? And the privilege that we may have as we have proximity to whiteness, right? I'm a light-skinned Latina, have indigenous ancestry, but I'm light-skinned, right? And so that gives me some sort of positionality that sometimes I get to use and sometimes I don't get to use, right? I at work, I have been told that I was the diversity hire plenty of times. And so I think it is important. And I think it's difficult because I think, and again, personally, I did not grow up in this, my formative years were not here. So the way that I see and perceive my positionality might be a little bit different because the trauma of people of color is different, and it's super complicated. But I think for someone who grew up here, who and I can't speak for those people, right? But just conversations that I've had, it's a lot to deal with mentally and emotionally, and where do you position yourself? That's been my observation. So I think it's just understand, and for me, it's understanding what's my positionality, right? In terms of skin color, education, access to language. I teach immigrant refugees, and it does not get lost on me that speaking two languages gives me a lot of advantages, right? Speaking English in this country, within my community, gives me a lot more privilege than other people. So I think just being cognizant of that, right? And where I can step in. And I think it was Tess. Tess said, sometimes stepping up means stepping back, right? So where do I step up to use that positionality, and when do I step back to center other people? And I have a very chatty cat that likes to chat when I'm talking. So I'm going to mute myself now.
I mean, racism, white supremacy is a white problem.
So switching gears just a little bit, question that I have is, how can multicultural mental health be incorporated into what it means to decolonize education, and what could that look like? I know that now that there's a lot of talk on mental health, especially just with everything that we've all gone through during the pandemic and being remote and being isolated, and especially as we look at schools opening up this coming fall, yeah, how can mental health, multicultural mental health be incorporated, and what could that look like in our schools?
I can start. So I've been in a lot of not a lot, but in various spaces where there have been conversations about the role and the presence of student resource officers and police officers in the school, and the need to get them out of the schools and to replace them with more mental health, and particularly multicultural mental health specialists, right? And I know we see often in schools this focus on social emotional learning and maybe trauma informed care. And there's a scholar called Sean Ginwright who has really put forth this notion or idea of healing centered engagement and the need for that with children, with our children of color, right? And how healing centered engagement is about moving beyond questions such as what happened to you towards questions of what is right with you. It is an asset driven and culturally grounded approach where the focus is the holistic restoration of our young people's identities while addressing the root causes of the harm, right? In order to achieve the well-being that we want to see rather than suppressing symptoms, right, that are coming out. And so I think the need to move towards more healing-centered engagement, but also to the question of multiculturalism, right? To practices that are culturally responsive, right? And that are approved by, accepted by our communities of color. The recognition that addressing mental health, that there's not this one size fit all approach, right? And that we have to be more culturally responsive and think about techniques and strategies that are used in our various communities of color, right? So for example, like the use of restorative healing circles that we see in some Indigenous and Black communities, the power of storytelling and testimonials, and the importance of utilizing curriculum that is culturally relevant and responsive. So that's what I would say. So replacing, like getting rid of these student resource officers and police officers in the school, and really making sure we have an adequate amount, an adequate number of these multicultural mental health specialists within the school.
I just want to add a little thing to that. I want to hear more about healing center engagement. I didn't know about it, so thank you for bringing it up. The other thing is in thinking about building community trust with parents, right? And just as a mother, right? I am already suspicious of overdiagnosing, medicating, and so I'm always my child is doing therapy, and I was very when I'm nervous, my Spanish accent comes out, just FYI. My rule was it has to be a person of color that I can talk to and know that they're gonna see my child as a whole person and not. And even with a person of color, there was a push to take this test that were so weird. And I'm like, I can't. I told her I'm not gonna do this because then I don't want this to be on her record and follow her, because I want her to look in a different way. And I'm not a therapist or a counselor, but I do know how quickly things get moving when you diagnose and overdiagnose. And so I think building community trust and dialogues, like testimonials and healing circles with parents and communities that, rightfully so, are already suspicious of certain authority figures, and giving resources to those multicultural and culturally responsive methodologies and ways of being, because they don't pay for themselves, and again, they shouldn't be free. They should be free for students, but the people doing it should also get paid. And definitely rethinking the way that we are funding and how we're funding in terms of disciplining and officers on campuses and things like that.
I really appreciate Catalina and Dr. Washington for helping me articulate what I've been trying to think about and pretty much what I've been going through. And, when they, articulating this, it just really dawned on me that, oh man, this is something that I'm going through as well. One of the ways that, if a student comes up to me, and there has been students that, that comes up to me and, talk about their issues, I'm there to, to listen. If they want, advice, and that's when I give advice. This is the weird, not only that, this student is, in the process of healing, I'm also in that process of healing. So when we talk with each other, when we have a discussion, it's almost like as if this is like a group type of like therapy. And there's been times that, students will just be comfortable. If students are comfortable enough with you, they'll come talk to you. And, the idea of, institutional counselors and things like that, a school sponsored, type of like, a lot of times it doesn't really work. And oftentimes it becomes some type of, rumorville type of thing, where somebody's going to be telling your business. And one of the ways that perhaps, that I cope with it or, survived it was really also talking or having discussions, or conversation with, with students and, sometimes faculty and sometimes also community members. And, within that, there's this, temporary type of relief that, somebody's actually can relate to what you're going through.
Yes.
If I could just add really quickly, thank you, Dr. Third, because another component of Sean Jen Wright's healing-centered engagement is supporting adults in their own healing process, right? Because we can't effectively help to support the healing process of our youth if we are not well. And so that is another component. So yeah, just wanted to share that.
Yes, I wanted to share a story to sort of emphasize what Dr. Third just said. And this is me being vulnerable in a room full of strangers, but I think we should also need to normalize mental health. And so I go to therapy, and I consider therapy like dating or finding a good therapist, like going on a date and you just can't find the right person. And I've gone through all this therapists, and they were mostly white, and I'm like, it's just never worked, right? I would go for a month or two, and I'm like, nope. And then earlier this year, I'm like, I wish I could have a therapist that was Latinx, a woman, immigrant, bilingual, a mother, an anti-racist, And I went and looked, and I found her. I looked around, I'm like, I want $1 million. Because the universe is giving me exactly what I want. And the difference, I just like, I don't want to if I said, if you ever move, I'm moving with you. Because the difference that she's made in the way that we talk, and we can go back and forth between the two languages, and she understands a lot of my upbringing, and being a mother. It makes a huge difference. And it goes back to like, if you're well, then you can take care of others. And then imagine what that would do to a child, right? To have someone, to have their own unicorn therapist. I call her my unicorn, and then now we've decided she's a dragon slayer. And so just think about how that would impact a young person, right? To have somebody that can have all those things that people need to be able to heal.
Most of the time, my elders are my therapists. I don't know if that's the right approach. Sometimes I'm thinking about, is my mom, should I be talking to my mom about this? These type of things. Or, oftentimes, I reach out to Velma, you know, if I'm like having some kind of stuff going on, it's really because, you know, a lot of them have experienced it, you know, they've been through the trauma. And oftentimes, you know, I would ask, man, how do folks do it? I mean, you guys have been in the movement for so long. How do you stay this long? Because I'm already like exhausted. And, you know, from them that I get this energy from. Because if they've been doing it for a long time, and a lot of folks a lot of elders, you know, in you know, their 60s or 70s and 80s, and they're still going at it. You know, to me, that's, you know, so it's some kind of relief to me. So yeah, but most of my therapists are elders. I don't know if that's wrong or right, but for some reason, it is what it is in my situation.
Thank you so much for all of those thoughts and opinions. We really appreciate it. Kind of switching gears again, this is a really broad topic, is how does ethnic studies play a role in decolonizing education? And how can we ensure that when ethnic studies is introduced in schools with largely colonial and racist curriculum, that it does not inadvertently perpetuate colonization?
Okay, I'll go. Oh, go ahead, Dr. Shanae. Go ahead, Shanae. Sorry.
No, yeah, so okay, I'll go. I think about like all the different iterations of asset pedagogies that we've seen over the past decades, you know, moving from culturally responsive to culturally relevant to culturally sustaining to Gholdy Muhammad's recent work in historical and culturally responsive something that I'm not remembering at the moment, and how oftentimes that gets translated into, oh, we're gonna include these topics, whether it be ethnic studies, right, or learning about the culture of, you know, the different communities that we serve, that it's merely included in the curriculum and not centered in the curriculum. Like, what would it look like to make ethnic studies and learning about the histories, the cultures, the heritages, the values of our children of color and those who, and their intersectional identities, right? What if that was the foundation of teaching and learning? What if we operated not from the white gaze? Because even when we're including, we're also like comparing to and often referencing, you know, the white experience and white ways of knowing, being, and doing, and their history, right? So I think to decolonize, we really have to move towards, we're centering ethnic studies, right? We're centering the histories, the cultures, the values, the what's important, the knowledge, you know, of communities of color within our curriculum. So I think that's a big part, moving away from inclusion to centering and operating from the Black, the indigenous, the brown gaze instead of the white gaze.
I love that. I want to share a quote, and I will give examples, but this sort of gets for me to answer this question. Yad Yassi is an author. She wrote Homegoing, wonderful book, brilliant writer. I'm jealous of her. When she wrote Homegoing, she was 26. I'm like, how can you do this? And so what her quote is, so when you study history, you must ask yourself, whose story am I missing? Whose voice was suppressed so that this voice could come forth? Once you figure that out, you must find that story too. From there, you get a clearer yet still imperfect picture. And I think it's what you're saying, right, Dr. Shanae, like centering ethnic studies, letting go of, this is the story that's been told for hundreds of years. We don't need to keep telling that story anymore. There's all these stories that haven't been told, you know, intentionally. So the role of ethnic studies is centering and decolonizing and building a new way of knowing and a new way of being. And I think that there's a question in the chat that might connect with this from, I forget, Samet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, my colleague Sumit had asked, how do we build curriculum for refugees and immigrants who have come from war-torn countries or do not have lived experiences in their country of origin? Many are disconnected and do not have space to learn about their history in school systems.
Right. And so that is such a perfect question for this other question, right? Because, you know, many are disconnected and do not have space to learn on their history in the school systems. Then let's make that space. Right? Let's get rid of the textbooks that say that African people came here as paid laborers or as laborers, right? That's what textbooks are telling our children. Let's get rid of these textbooks and let's co-create curriculum with our students. I teach immigrant and refugee students as well. And there is co-creation of knowledge and new ways of being, and not just from the trauma part, right? But who are we? Who what do we love to do? What is important to me? What stories are important? So there is one activity that I do, and it takes weeks to do it, but what comes out of it, and you know, the point of my class is language building. So I'm not teaching explicit grammar or sentence structure. We're just being ourselves in sharing what we already know. So I tell students, you're bringing what you already know into the classroom, and we're just using language to talk about it together. And so it's called an identity cultural box, and they bring 5 items into the class, and they describe what it means to them. You know, if it has a history in their country, or if it became something of who they are. And every quarter, the feedback that I get is that's their favorite activity. And the conversations that have come from those, that I really just step out as a teacher. I've simply become a facilitator. And then students sort of drive the conversation. I was telling my students, there's one time where I had a room full of, there was 30 students, and one night we had the identity box, and one student brought the Quran, another student brought the Bible, another student brought a Buddhist altar. She brought everything and built the altar in the class. And we all talked about it, and they all asked each other questions that they were worried about asking other places, or they had never been able to ask. I said nothing the entire time. I was just sitting back in the back, watching this happening, sort of, you know, giddy. And so we can create those spaces, right? Is how do we push back on policies that don't allow for these spaces to be built in our classroom, especially K through 12. I teach in a community college, so I have a little, I mean, I have some outcomes, but I get to do whatever I want in my classroom, right? But in a K through 12, you know, for those of you who are in K through 12, you know more than I do. And how do you push back on that? Like, why do we need to use this textbook? Let's use this. Let's build together, right? You know, a lot of us probably have to learn a lot about other countries and cultures, and then let students drive it. Why do we need to gatekeep our students from their own knowledge, right? They you know, I my field, English language teaching is zipped in saviorism, right? Like, and it's students are teachers. Some teachers are like, oh well, we just have to help them because, you know, they're here in this new country. And I'm like, they navigated their way from their country to here. They know more about navigation than any of us do. So let's just get that out of the, you know, let's not do that. Now I'm rambling, so I'm just going to stop there. But let's co-create and step out of the way.
As much as students learn from me, I also learn a lot from the students, and them being involved in teaching. As much I'm involved in teaching, for me, is key. That, you know, I just can't be, you know, in front of you for an hour and a half or 2 hours just talking, learning is like two ways or multiple ways. And the strategy called instructional conversation, I would have students, teach, instead of me right in the front, students are the one, teaching each other because, they also have experiences and their experience matter. And, extensive studies have shown that, if we center students around, the curriculum that we teach instead of we center the curriculum around the students, right? Academic, opportunities will most likely increase. And there's been, there's the one Stanford study about ethnic studies in the Bay, where all these high schoolers, were learning, first they started off with like a low GPA, and they start to, the teachers started implement ethnic studies in the classroom. And after that, a lot of the students increase their GPA for what it's worth by 1.4 points, not 0.4, but 1.4. So the idea of ethnic studies, is a tool for empowerment, especially for Black, Indigenous, and other students of color that's been really historically marginalized. And yeah, we can talk about, the trauma within ethnics, because a lot of folks is thinking like ethnic studies all about, trauma stories or things like that. It ain't really that's part of it, but there's also a part that a lot of people are not talking about, that, BIPOC contributions to the world. I mean, Black folks invented math. Black folks invented science. And when a Black student hears that, folks get interested. Indigenous folks build the pyramids. They also had math. They also have science. For the folks that's been, BIPOC students, students of color has been marginalized by it. And when they hear it, it's almost like a breath of fresh air. This is something new. It's not really new. It's been there. We're really just, bringing it up, because to me, Reconstructionist or revisionist history is the history that's currently right now, which is the white supremacist history books. To me, that's revisionist, because, if it wasn't for the Moors, Spain and Europe wouldn't have castles. And yet we think that castles equivocate to Europe, when it's really African. Because if you go to Ethiopia, there's castles out in Ethiopia that's way older than the castles of Europe. And mind you, before the Moors came, which is, these Black Muslims, right? These kings and queens of Europe were living in barns. Were living in stables. They were unsanitary. And, and then if you go back, within the Americas, especially in the United States, there are pyramids made by Native Americans in Illinois, in East Illinois, all along the Mississippi River. Right now, there are pyramids. They're being discovered in Georgia, because it's so big that, they really have to kind of, scan it. I mean, when students hear those things, that that BIPOCs are actually the originators of math, science, physics, music, all kinds of music. When folks are saying, oh, how about country music? No, man, that country music is the white man's blues. That still came from Black folks. Classical music came from Black folks. Piano came from Black folks. It's a harp that got put in a box. When students hear those things, Indigenous folks had been doing medicine. It just transformed the whole classroom. A lot of folks just, they get engaged. And most of the time they take your class again. You know, because these are the things that has not been talked about. Because when I learned about these things, I was mind blown. And for me, you know, I have to pass it forward. For whoever taught me that, I have to pass it forward to others, Black students, Indigenous students, and other students of color, because these are the things that makes a lot of us confident when we center ourselves. Because, you know, when white students come in, they learn about the history. Who did they learn? White folks. And then when I ask them, you know, so what did folks learn about, you know, Black history? A lot of them would say enslavement. They're not even saying enslavement. Oh, they were slaves. And using that word is like, you know, they weren't slaves, they were enslaved. Because before that, you know, a lot of folks got kidnapped, and these folks that got kidnapped are highly literate. I mean, there are like narratives out there, you know, that there were like enslaved Africans who can read and write in Arabic. You know, these folks were engineers, these folks were doctors that got kidnapped, and for some reason, folks are uncivilized. When in reality, the last folks that really got civilized were the Europeans. And when white students take that, you know, they don't get mad. You know, they get clarified. And again, a lot of these things is the way how we learn things. So within ethnic studies, you know, if we could center, you know, our students, especially, you know, Black, Indigenous, and other students of color, you know, there's going to be a lot of academic excellence, academic achievement or opportunities that's going to transpire. And, you know, it might solve some of our problems. You know, when you're on that Paulo Freire, that Bell Hooks pedagogy, that Audre Lorde pedagogy, that Hanani K. Trask pedagogy, you know, it changed a lot of people. And the unfortunate thing is, like, you know, it's taking them 18 years to change, and next thing you know, they're all pissed off. So how are you going to do? How are you going to transfer that energy? Are you just going to be pissed off forever? And rightfully so, you should be pissed off. But how are we going to transform that into some type of empowerment? How are you going to pay this forward? Because this knowledge was given to me by my elders and the community, so on and so forth. And this is what I'm passing to you. So a lot of this is each one teach one. And, you know, I just can't be the teacher. I just can't be the professor, because these students also have experiences. They have knowledge. They have things that I don't even know about, and I can learn from them.
I just wanted to give a moment if either Carolina or Dr. Shanae would like to add any more.
I do. Thank you for giving space for that. Like listening to Dr. Third just made me think about what I learned in my own studies and learned from other Black and Indigenous scholars, that it's important where you start the story, right? And we think about where they often start the story in our school system, right? With colonial invasion and how they took this uncivilized world and made it into this great civilization called the United States, while ignoring the history that Indigenous people existed and thrived on these lands for millennia, thousands of years before the first European colonizers came over. So it matters where you start the story, right? They don't start the story with the great civilizations of Africa, right? Where we brought over enslaved and enslaved, Africans. So it's important where we start the story, but I also think of Indigenous scholars like Eve Tuck and her person she often writes with, Wayne, I think it's Wayne Yang, where they talk about moving away from damage-centered portrayals of Indigenous people and other people of color, and having a more desire-based portrayal of these communities, right? That yes, we have to acknowledge the stories of harm and trauma, but we also need to talk about survivance, right? Within these communities, survivance that combines survival and resistance. The fact that they fought, the fact that they resisted, the fact that they are still here today, right? So as we think about how we begin the story, also think about the present day stories that we tell, and how oftentimes Indigenous peoples after a certain date are erased from history as if they no longer exist, right? So are we still talking about sharing stories of the continued existence and thrivance of Indigenous communities? So this is just what came to mind as I was listening to Dr. Bird.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to fall into the, for lack of a better expression, trauma porn when it comes to teaching in ethnic studies, right? But like, I love that expression, oh my gosh, the resistance and the survivance. What was that word again, Shani? Survivance, right? Because it is survival and it is resistance, and I would add brilliance. And there's just so much there that is never told, right? And it's part of that intentional erasure. So thank you. That fires me up.
I apologize if I'm taking too much space. Didn't mean to take up space. Yeah, I mean, existence is resistance, and loving yourself is revolutionary. I mean, even if we have even us saying that, it's like, what is going on?
So a question from Nestor in the chat is, from an Indigenous Pacific Islanders perspective, is it even possible to use a space like education to decolonize? In the past, education was the main tool for colonizing Native and Indigenous people, and our way of passing knowledge like oral tradition, dance, arts are not something that is usually considered academic knowledge. And when we're in education spaces, teachers just take our knowledge for free with no recognition or pay. And I hate how these education spaces make me more white or like the colonizer than more of an Indigenous person.
Could you repeat the first part of the question?
From an Indigenous Pacific Islanders perspective, is it even possible to use spaces like education to decolonize, as education was the main tool for colonizing Native and Indigenous people?
I can go first. So before I moved to Seattle, I've been in Seattle for 2 years. I was in Boston working on my PhD, and had the privilege and the honor of being able to engage with and learn from an Indigenous community in New England, mainly like a Wampanoag community, and was really able to, like, what I witnessed in that community, the advocacy, the agency that this community utilized and engaged in to really advocate for cultural and language revitalization within the school district that most of their children were attending. And so, yes, they were engaging with the schools, but they were also working to establish and to create their own tribal run and tribal centric schools. And in talking with different community members in that community, I recall a vivid conversation with one of the Indigenous parents who was also a leader in the community there, who really said that, like, we're always and constantly working to find funding to be able to support the creation of our own schools, because that is truly the only way that we can truly decolonize education, right? But and at the same time, recognizing that until they get to that point, that the majority of their kids are still within the public school system. And so what I saw there was these community leaders working to form partnerships with the leaders in that district. These community leaders were going after huge, like $1 million grants to be able to fund their language and cultural revitalization initiatives within the school. They were able to come in and partner with the school district to provide professional development for the educators in the district, to teach them not only Wampanoag history and culture and values, but also Pan-Indigenous history, culture, and values, and to equip them with resources that they might use in their instruction within this in the school district. They also were active and advocating for, like, please, like, invite us, you know, have us in as parents, have us in as community members to be able to teach this cultural knowledge, right? Because the majority of the teachers in this district were white. And so you also have the problem of, can they even effectively teach, you know, our community knowledge and our community histories, right? So the importance of really working alongside and partnering with and asking, like, you have this wealth of knowledge and resources right up the street from you, right in the community. And to what extent are you asking and reaching out and compensating? Because I heard Carolina mention this repeatedly throughout this conversation of the importance of compensating folks of color as you're asking for their help and bringing them in as instructors, educators, consultants, advisors. And so I witnessed that it is possible, like through this Wampanoag community in New England, for tribal communities to take leadership in, right, to advocate for, and to be able to, like, really be the initiators of language and cultural revitalization within communities.
Thank you. I want to acknowledge, Nestor, I read the question, and I want to acknowledge, and I feel the pain and the frustration in your words. And I want to acknowledge that. You know, I think I'm with you, right? How, when schools have been used to strip of knowledge and values and beliefs and practices to uphold white supremacy and maintain the status quo, how can, you know, how can you rebuild with that tool? That's something that I myself as an ELL teacher struggle with a lot. At this, you know, so this made me think of, you know, the pragmatics myself is, how do we fix this? What can we do? And when, you know, it makes me think of the lack of BIPOC teachers in teacher programs and in schools, K through 12 and higher ed, right? And the idea of, I want to dismantle this idea of academic knowledge. What's that mean? Right? Was that, is this, sure, we're supposed to know that I've been talking a lot about plagiarism, and I don't want to go into that tangent, right? But what does plagiarism means in this society versus other societies where knowledge is not owned by one individual, right? So it makes me think of, again, policies and systems that have been put in place to uphold white supremacy, right? And so how do we push for anti-racist BIPOC teachers and teacher training programs that are designed by and for BIPOC teachers? And then those teachers come into our schools and dismantle this idea of academic knowledge, because oral tradition, dance, and arts it's so powerful, right? I teach dance on the side, and it's a big part of who I am as a teacher in my classroom, right? Using movement and being with your body and your mind and your spirit at the same time. It's something that schools have not done. So I love what Dr. Shanae said about the school in New England, and that is possible, right? And at the same time is we must have programs designed for and by BIPOC teachers who are anti-racist and and focus on decolonization. That's my dream world as a teacher and as a hopefully one day teacher leader.
For the first question, I believe it's possible if that teacher or that professor has decolonizing pedagogy, curriculum, so on and so forth. And I also teach hip hop in context for the civil rights movement and comparative history of ideas. And if I'm gonna have students write an academic paper, what is that saying about hip hop? And and I always get advice from local hip hop artists, and the way you really put it, folks put at it, if you're having them, write an academic paper, that ain't hip hop. So a lot of these things that I assigned either, well, you have to write 16 bars of all these articles that you read, things like that. How are you going to put this in 16 bars? How are you going to make a playlist? How are you going to, do a DJ, whatever to connect it to these things. Again, I'm not teaching them how to be hip hop. Okay. I'm just, because I don't want to participate in that cultural appropriation, because that's not my place. What I'm trying to do is use HHBE, hip hop based education, to connect historical narratives, so on and so forth, and what folks come out of it. And this is pretty much the same thing, across my class. Like what I said, I don't do tests. I don't do multiple choices and things like that. I'm really trying to, make an effort to, make everything non-white, non-Eurocentric for whatever it is. And as far as compensation or not getting paid, I agree. Because oftentimes we've been, used and abused and stealing, our knowledges, and then they get their PhDs. Because these folks who got their PhDs, they go to the community, they interview people. And if it wasn't for the community that they're interviewing, they won't have a degree. It's just Margaret Mead type of thing, Margaret Mead went to Samoa for 6 months, and next thing you know, you just start making, she started making things up. And for some reason, she's the mother of anthropology. And, where is the equity? And every time that I have guest speakers out, we have, between Velma and I's class, we have a lot of guest speakers. We always make a point, to pay. If I'm having a panel discussions, I always make a point to pay these folks. They're, pay the fee. You just got to pay the fee. If you don't pay the fee, where's the equity? And the critique that I have with the American Ethnic Studies Department at UW is, I don't understand how their budget is only $50 for a speaker. And, that's a different discussion to have. But yeah, for me, I got to get this money, so folks would be able to share their knowledge. I'm paying folks for the knowledge and their time and their effort.
Can I add one last thing? Sorry, it's a quote. I love quotes.
Yes, please.
And I shared this quote with a group of wonderful colleagues that I'm working with. Two of them are here today. And this quote is by Sonia Grant with, she wrote Red Pedagogy. And it says, while Red Pedagogy is not meant solely for Native American teachers or teachers of Native American students, as educators, we must begin to understand how to infuse our beliefs, practices, and epistemologies to restructure our inherently colonized classrooms, curricula, and pedagogies, especially when working in public schools. As a friend always reminds me, we cannot teach it if we do not live it. They, the youth, know when we're pretending. And that's a quote that is, I live by, right? What practices, beliefs, epistemologies do I bring into the classroom, and how are they colonizing or decolonizing? Because they can do both, and it's very easy to not notice it. And this is something that we have to be constantly thinking about.
Thank you, Carolina. So apologies, we did go a little bit over schedule, but I want to first off say thank you so much to our panelists for being on the call with us today, answering all these questions, and really guiding this conversation for us. I hope I was able to get to as many people as I possibly could in the chat with your questions. And yeah, with that, this is the first of our Decolonizing Education series leading up to our conference in the fall, in November 3rd through the 5th. Our next Lunch and Learn will be August 4th, and we'll be focusing on specifically decolonizing curriculum. So be looking out on our socials for when that is posted, and hopefully y'all can join us for that conversation as well. Again, thank you to our panelists, and thank you to everyone who was able to be here and participate with us today. We really appreciate it. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye.